The lights of the flagship Lightbringer flickered as it coasted through the cosmos, its sleek, silver hull reflecting the dim glow of distant stars. Captain Alina Trevors stood at the helm, her fingers gripping the smooth, polished console with a quiet intensity. The stars outside seemed to distort, as if the very fabric of space was bending in ways no one could understand. The Light Star System, as it was called, had been the subject of endless speculation, countless scientific missions, and, lately, war. And now, at this moment, it was the last battlefield for humanity. For years, the VWEX-X, an alien race with strange psychic abilities, had relentlessly attacked human colonies, slowly draining the resources and will of humankind. And now, in this final, desperate stand, the last remnants of Earth's starships had gathered here, in the shadow of the mysterious system. They weren't just fighting the VWEX-X anymore. They were fighting something far more dangerous, the unknown. "Captain," came the voice of Lieutenant Marcus Rowe, his face lit by the dim blue light of his command terminal. "We're entering the system's outer perimeter. We'll be in range of the VWEX-X within the hour." Alina nodded, her mind elsewhere. She could hear the low hum of the ship's engines, feel the nervous energy of her crew pulsing through the air. It had been so long since any of them had felt peace, if any of them had ever known it. There was no real victory to be had here, not for humanity. They were just stalling for time. Stalling for a chance to do something, anything, that might turn the tide. "We're ready," she replied, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She knew they weren't ready. They couldn't be. No one was ready for the forces that awaited them. "Have you heard about the VWEX-X demands?" Rowe asked, his voice tight with sarcasm. A quick glance at his display told her all she needed to know. Another one of their ridiculous diplomatic demands. The VWEX-X had a peculiar way of negotiating. They were one of the most formidable enemies humanity had ever faced, yet they seemed obsessed with strange rituals and mind games. "They want us to solve their puzzles before they attack. A ceasefire until we answer them," Rowe continued, rolling his eyes. "If you ask me, they're just trying to stall." Alina turned from the window to face him. "I think they're trying to break us. They always did." She paused, looking back toward the stars, her face hardening. "We won't let them." The brief moment of levity dissolved. The VWEX-X had always been a puzzle, an enigma that defied all logic. But now they had something worse to contend with. As the fleet approached the star system, something strange had begun to happen. The technology began to malfunction. Navigation was off by increments so small they couldn't see them at first, but they felt it. The stars outside the ship no longer seemed fixed, but swirling, like the sky itself was being rewritten, as if the very laws of physics were being bent and twisted in a way that was impossible to understand. "Captain," Rowe said, now clearly unsettled, "something's wrong." "The stars, there's something wrong with the stars." "They don't, I know," Alina said, cutting him off. "It's the system. It's doing this. We're being pulled in." Rowe's fingers flew over his controls, but the data on his screen was unreadable. Static had begun to flood the feed. It wasn't normal interference. It was as if the stars themselves were trying to speak, sending signals that bypassed their technology, speaking directly to their minds. Then, from the corner of her eye, Alina noticed something that made her breath catch, a flicker of light from the outer range, a small, but unmistakable silhouette. A ship. The VWEX-X fleet. Without hesitation, Alina's voice rang through the ship's comms. "Prepare for combat." The Lightbringer shuddered as its weapon systems came online. Outside, the VWEX-X fleet appeared, sleek black ships with angular designs that seemed to shimmer in the light, their strange shapes evoking an almost organic feel. The lead ship of the VWEX-X was larger than any human vessel, a grotesque creature of metal and energy that rippled with psychic energy. "Ready, Captain," Rowe said, his voice colder now. The VWEX-X were known for their devastating psychic attacks, but the true terror lay in their ability to manipulate minds, to twist thoughts and emotions until their victims fell into madness. "Hold steady," Alina ordered. Her hands gripped the console tighter. She had fought countless battles before, but this one felt different. In her gut, she knew that this battle wasn't just about weapons or tactics. It was something deeper. "Captain," shouted Dr. Eleanor Quinlan, the ship's medic, from her station on the lower decks. "We've got strange readings. Crew members are starting to report disturbances. Hallucinations. It's not just the VWEX-X. The system itself, it's affecting us." Alina's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it now, the pulse of the light system itself, a subtle pressure in the air, almost like an electric hum running just beneath the surface of their perceptions. "Maintain focus," Alina said through gritted teeth. "We hold the line, no matter what." But as soon as the words left her mouth, the world seemed to warp. The ship jerked violently, throwing crew members off balance. Then, a series of flashes, like lightning, seemed to strike the ship, and everything went silent. The lights flickered, and the ship was thrown into complete darkness for a brief moment before the emergency lights blinked on. Alina struggled to her feet, feeling the disorientation settling in. A voice echoed in her mind, strange and foreign, like a whisper on the edge of her consciousness. She shook her head, trying to clear it. "Stay with me, Captain," Rowe said, his voice strained. He too looked disoriented. "This is not normal. It's the system. It's warping reality." "Damn it," Alina muttered. "We can't fight this." Suddenly, the ship lurched again. Alina grabbed the nearest console to steady herself, but it wasn't the ship shaking. It was something deeper, an inner disturbance, a resonance between their minds and the system itself. Their reality was slipping, bit by bit. Then, she heard the voice again. This time, louder. "Alina," it was a soft whisper, barely audible. But it was unmistakable. It came from the ship itself. "Alina, it's your turn," her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if it was real, if the words were from the VWEX-X or from something deeper, something inside the light itself. But she knew one thing, the battle wasn't just for the future of humanity anymore. It was for their very souls. As the battle raged outside, the Lightbringer's crew was forced to confront something much darker than the VWEX-X. Each of them began to see things, visions, twisted realities that echoed their worst fears. Alina found herself standing in her childhood home, the walls covered in dust. She could hear her mother's voice, soft and comforting, but when she turned, she saw only shadows. Her younger brother, lost to a childhood accident, stood at the center, staring at her with vacant eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, in a sudden flash, his eyes turned red, his face contorting with grief and anger. "You couldn't save me," he whispered. Her heart pounded as she tried to speak, but no words came out. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and she fell into the darkness. Alina's heart raced as the darkness swallowed her whole. Her hands reached out, groping for something solid, but there was nothing. The world around her twisted and turned in impossible angles, like a funhouse mirror distorting the edges of reality. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and she tried to focus, tried to ground herself, but the shadows of her past were too loud, too powerful. The image of her brother lingered in the darkness, his hollow eyes fixed on her, accusing her. "You couldn't save me." She stumbled backward, the air growing thick around her, pressing in on her chest. She shook her head, trying to clear the weight of the guilt, the grief. The memory was an old wound, one she had buried deep beneath layers of armor and responsibility. But now, the light system was bringing it all back, every fear, every regret, every mistake. "You couldn't save anyone." The words echoed through her mind, not her brother's voice this time but something deeper, something that seemed to crawl out of the very fabric of the system itself. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the ground, her palms scraping against the cold, slick floor of the ship. She looked around, but there was nothing. No walls, no consoles, no escape. Only the haunting presence of her own failure. A sudden flash of light broke through the darkness, blinding her for a moment. When the light faded, Alina found herself back on the Lightbringer's command deck, her hands gripping the console once more. But everything had changed. The ship wasn't the same. The walls pulsed with an otherworldly glow, and the air crackled with strange energy. Her crew, too, had vanished, every last one of them, leaving her alone, stranded in the heart of this alien nightmare. The voice came again, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the voice of her brother. It wasn't the voice of the system. It was something more, personal. You are the key, Alina. The voice wrapped itself around her, soothing and invasive at once, pulling her deeper into the web. Her hands shook as she reached for the console, trying to regain control, but the ship resisted. It was no longer just a ship, it was something else entirely. The boundaries between the ship and the light had blurred, and she felt herself slipping, losing her grip on reality. The lights flickered again, and the console screens went dark, replaced by cryptic symbols that twisted and turned like living things. Alina's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't alone, but no matter how hard she searched, she couldn't see who or what was watching her. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on her, and she suddenly realized that the ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a prison, a trap designed to draw them in, to break them apart. And she was its most willing prisoner. Captain? The voice came from behind her, a soft, tentative whisper that made her spin around. It was Ro, but not Ro. His face was distorted, twisted with an eerie, unnatural grin. His eyes glowed with a strange, pale light, and his body seemed to shimmer like a mirage. Marcus? Alina gasped, stepping back. He tilted his head, his grin widening. I'm not Marcus anymore, Alina. I'm what the light has made of him. What the light has made of all of us. Her stomach churned. No. This is just a vision. A hallucination. The warped version of Ro stepped closer, his form flickering as though he were made of smoke. You think you can fight it? The light will consume us all, Captain. It already has. Alina's chest tightened. I won't let it. You already have, he replied, his voice low and hypnotic. You're just too blind to see it. Alina's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to summon the strength to fight back. But the words, the fear, the uncertainty were starting to break her down. She had no idea how much longer she could hold on. The system was manipulating her, twisting her thoughts and fears until there was nothing left to cling to. You're nothing but a failure, the voice whispered, its presence creeping in from every direction. You failed him. You failed them all. No. Alina shouted, her voice trembling. I won't let it win. But as soon as the words left her lips, the entire ship seemed to shudder. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through her very bones. The walls began to ripple, as if they were made of liquid, and the shadows in the corners grew longer, more ominous. Suddenly, everything went quiet. For a moment, Alina thought the nightmare had ended. The oppressive pressure lifted, and the ship returned to normal. The holographic screens flickered back to life, showing the usual readouts, the star charts, the fleet status. She looked around, half expecting to see her crew, to hear their voices. But they were still gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the light system. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned to face the viewport, her eyes widening as she saw what was waiting for her beyond the ship's hull. The VWX fleet was advancing, their ships cutting through the swirling nebula of light like dark predators stalking their prey. The lead VWX ship, its massive, jagged form, loomed closer, its weapons charging, the psychic energy swirling around it in waves. Captain, Ro's voice echoed in her mind, far clearer than it had ever been before. It was no longer a distorted version of him, this was something different. The light was using him, using them all. "You're going to lose this battle, Captain," the voice said, low and haunting. "You can't fight what you don't understand. You can't fight what's already inside of you." The warning was clear, but it did nothing to stem the growing sense of dread. Alina knew she had to act, and act quickly. The VWEX-X would attack any moment now, and if she didn't regain control of her ship, she would be as much a prisoner of this place as the rest of her crew. Alina stepped toward the console, gripping it with both hands. She had to focus. She had to fight against the pull of the light. "Ro," she called out, trying to steady herself. "Where are you? Where is the crew?" But there was no answer. Only the oppressive hum of the ship. The VWEX-X ships were growing closer. In that moment, Alina knew what she had to do. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her crew, for humanity. The battle wasn't just against the VWEX-X, it was against the very system itself. The light had no mercy, no logic, no reason. It twisted everything it touched, leaving only ruin in its wake. "Lieutenant Ro," Alina said, her voice steady now, full of determination. "I need you with me. All of you. If we're going to get through this, we fight as one." Her mind stretched out, reaching for something, anything that could reconnect her to her crew, to her purpose. But there was nothing but emptiness. The light was pulling everything apart, one piece at a time, and yet, deep within her, Alina found something. A flicker of resolve, a thread of strength. She knew what she had to do. "All hands," she said, her voice echoing through the command deck. "We have one chance. One chance to break free. We fight together, or we die alone." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the ship's lights flickered again, and a series of low hums filled the air. The crew, the real crew, began to return, as if they were emerging from a long, dark dream. They were shaken, disoriented, but they were there. They were with her, and together, they would face whatever the light had in store for them. The hum of the ship seemed to steady, a deep, resonant vibration that matched the thumping of Alina's heart. The Lightbringer was no longer a haunted vessel drifting aimlessly through the warp of the Light Star system. It was a ship again, at least for now. Her crew had returned, each man and woman shaken, their eyes wide with confusion and dread, but they were here, and that was enough. "Captain," Ro's voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was real. His form stood next to the helm, his face pale, his features slack as though the ordeal had drained something from him that he might never get back. He was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling, but resolute. "We're not alone out there. Not anymore." She didn't need to ask what he meant. She could see it herself, as her gaze shifted toward the viewport. The VWEX-X fleet loomed large in the distance, its ships now circling, not closing in for an attack but seemingly waiting, hovering in a dreadful patience that sent chills down her spine. The battle had only just begun. The Lightbringer shuddered again, a low, growling noise reverberating through the walls, as though the ship itself was responding to the silent, unseen force in the system. The stars outside the viewport flickered, their light stretching in unnatural arcs. It wasn't like any kind of cosmic distortion she had seen before. The light had begun to reach into the depths of their minds again. Alina could feel it in her bones, the cold embrace of something old and vast. "Captain, what do we do?" Ro's voice brought her back to the present. His hand was on the armrest of the seat beside her, his fingers trembling. Alina didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. The answer wasn't simple. They had to win this battle, there was no other choice. But victory seemed impossible. The VWEX-X, with their formidable psychic abilities, were bad enough. Now, they were up against an ancient force that lived within the light itself, and that force wasn't about to let them leave. "We hold the line," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Get the fleet into position. We fight back, just like we always have." A series of muffled commands echoed through the ship's comm system. Officers scrambled to their stations, their hands moving in practiced synchronicity, though Alina could feel the dread seeping through their every movement. How could they fight something that wasn't flesh or bone, something that twisted the very fabric of space and time? How could they fight what was already inside them? As the crew took their positions, Alina took a steadying breath. There was no other choice. She would not let this system, this force, break her. The VWXX were just one enemy. The light was another. And Alina had learned long ago that when the odds were impossible, the only thing that mattered was resolve. "All hands, prepare for battle," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the fog of doubt in her own mind. "We fight for humanity. We fight for each other." The ship's engines roared to life as it shot forward, cutting through the swirling nebula of light and darkness. The VWXX fleet seemed to shift in the distance, their ships rearranging into formations that weren't just tactical, they were psychic, a wall of energy forming before them. It wasn't just an attack, they were probing, testing, reaching into the minds of the crew, looking for the cracks, the weaknesses. "Captain, we're being affected," Rose said, his voice strained. His hands were shaking, his eyes wide and unfocused. "The VWXX are pushing us. We can't, hold steady." Alina snapped, but her own words wavered. She could feel it too. The weight in the air, the crushing pressure of the light pressing against their minds. It was like a storm was breaking inside her skull, the force of her own thoughts warping into something alien. She saw flashes of memories that weren't hers, heard voices that didn't belong to her. The air seemed to pulse with energy, and the crew around her fought to keep their focus. Alina's vision blurred, but she forced herself to center. The VWXX were closing in. They would attack soon. She wouldn't give in. Not now. Not when they were so close to losing everything. "Engage the weapon systems," she shouted. She couldn't hear the confirmation, her voice was drowned out by the psychic roar of the light that was beginning to swallow everything, but she could feel the ship responding. The weapons were online. They could fight. They could still fight. A series of blinding flashes erupted as the first wave of VWXX ships began to fire. The Lightbringer shuddered violently, but it held together. The shots from the VWXX were like lightning, piercing the space around them, but the human fleet retaliated with a powerful, coordinated barrage. The explosions lit up the darkness, like stars dying in the vacuum of space, but the VWXX didn't falter. The psychic field around their fleet flared, a shimmering dome of energy that absorbed the human firepower as if it were nothing. The human ships fired again and again, but each shot seemed to fall short, absorbed by the VWXX's psychic defenses. "Captain." Rose's voice cut through her thoughts, his tone tight. "They're in our minds. They're breaking us down." Alina gritted her teeth. She could feel it now, too. The VWXX were more than just attackers, they were manipulators, playing with their minds, feeding on their fears. The light was amplifying it, twisting the battlefield into something out of a nightmare. "You are nothing," the voice whispered, and it wasn't the VWXX this time. It was the light. "You cannot win. You cannot save anyone." Alina's hands tightened around the control panel. The voice echoed through her skull, gnawing at her thoughts, but she pushed it down. She couldn't give in. Not now. "Focus," she barked. "Focus, damn it. We fight with everything we have." Her words seemed to snap the crew back to reality, but only for a moment. The VWXX were relentless, their ships moving in synchronized patterns that felt almost like a dance, an intricate web of psychic energy. Every move they made seemed calculated, designed to probe for weakness, to exploit the fears inside their enemies. A shadow passed over the bridge, and Alina's blood ran cold. The ship had shuddered again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the light warping reality. This was something else. A presence. Something that wasn't the VWXX, but something far older. Something far more dangerous. The light had begun to speak. Alina, she froze. The voice, smooth and cold, dripped with an ancient malice. She could feel it inside her mind, inside her bones. I am the light. You have come to me, and now you will die with me. No, Alina whispered through clenched teeth. I won't die. Not today. She turned toward the control panel, reaching for the one option she had left. There was a protocol buried deep in the ship's files, something she had never hoped to use. A failsafe. A desperate measure. Alina's hand hovered over the panel, trembling. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision bearing down on her. This was the endgame. There was no going back, but if she didn't do this now, if she didn't make this choice, then the light would consume them all. Her fingers pressed down, the ship lurched forward, as though it had been struck by an unseen hand. The lights flickered again, and the entire vessel seemed to shudder as if caught in a violent storm. Alina felt the pressure in her chest build until it seemed like her very lungs were being squeezed out of her. The light was pushing back, fighting her, but she wouldn't stop. No more. The Lightbringer glowed with an otherworldly radiance, its engines roaring as though they were alive. Alina's hand remained on the panel, channeling every ounce of energy she had left. She could feel the crew, their presence growing weaker, their wills bending under the pressure. All hands, she called out, her voice strained but defiant. We will not bow to this force. We will make our own destiny. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. The choice was clear. She would end it. She would save them all. Alina activated the final sequence. The ship's core exploded with brilliant light, a wave of energy that washed over everything. The VWEX, their psychic shields overwhelmed by the power, were scattered like leaves in the wind. The light, the force that had manipulated them, that had twisted their minds, was drawn into the heart of the ship, consumed by the very power it had sought to control. The battle was over, and Alina's last thought before everything went dark was simple: she had won.